Climate change has always been part of the Copenhagen Consensus, but it's never done particularly well. It's always ended at or near the bottom. I think this is partly the right conclusion because I don't think there's any evidence to support that climate change is the most pressing problem in the world, or even the most pressing environmental problem in the world. Um, I also think that this conclusion is partly wrong or perhaps misleading. The Copenhagen Consensus has been set up to sort of the way the panel acts in the Copenhagen Consensus is really as the board that advises this hypothetical charity, and it's investing a fixed budget. And for that, it looks at a benefit cost ratio, which is a perfectly sensible thing to do. But the way the Copenhagen Consensus conclusions are presented, at least in part of the media, is as if these were public priority public investment priorities, which is a different question altogether, because essentially when you have a positive or a benefit cost ratio that is greater than 1 and it doesn't fit within your fixed budget, then by the rules of benefit cost analysis, you should borrow the money if you don't have it. And that is an option that has not been given to the Copenhagen Consensus, and therefore I think its interpretation or its presentation of the conclusions in the media is often very wrong. And the simple reason that climate doesn't fit, doesn't easily compare with the other problems that are being discussed, is that it simply happens at a completely different scale. We are not talking about millions of dollars, we are not talking about billions of dollars, we are talking about trillions of dollars, both on the benefit side of the climate problem and on the cost side. And I must add that I think that one of the reasons that climate change tends to end up at the bottom is partly to do with the whole setup. And we see that again today, that the other topics are there in person, we are here on the phone, the other topics are represented by one speaker who presumably gives a coherent talk, whereas we, with climate change, have a cacophony of 4 speakers or more even. And I just don't think that that is a fair comparison, and I hope that the panel will consider that. Next slide, please. Now, comparing the topic that I'm supposed to address, that is greenhouse gas emission reduction, or rather carbon dioxide emission reduction, and the other policies for climate that have been forwarded. Starting with R&D, emission reduction and R&D are complements. That is, you need to do both. But the relationship between the two is perhaps a bit different than was suggested in the Copenhagen Consensus of 2009, that was specifically on climate. We know how to supply the world's energy needs without emitting a single ton of carbon dioxide, and we know how to do that 10 times over. We don't need innovation. We know how to do this. The problem with carbon neutral technologies at the moment is that they're too expensive. So what we need is not invention, new blueprints, but what we need is innovation and diffusion, bringing these things to the market and conquering a large market share. And for that, you actually don't want a charity or a government subsidizing R&D. What you want is to give companies incentives to do these things. So it's a completely different story than some people would like you to believe, and definitely giving money to R&D has a track record of very little success. Turning to other adaptation, mitigation and adaptation are substitutes. If you do more of the one, you do the other. But all the studies that I've seen on this particular subject, but more generally as well, is that a corner solution is actually unwise. You definitely cannot do with adaptation because we cannot avoid all climate change. But also the projections of impacts of climate change are so severe that you actually do not want to solve the entire problem through adaptation, and you want to do both. And a corner solution is simply unwise. Geoengineering is the 4th option on the menu for today. I think that geoengineering is for the desperate. Really, if everything goes wrong, there's a lot of uncertainty about climate change, and there are fat tails out there, and so on and so forth. Only if we end up really far out in the tail, I would recommend geoengineering. The only reason that we would want to talk about geoengineering is that it's so cheap and so simple that, in fact, a country like North Korea or an organization like Al Qaeda can actually do it to us, and we would want to know what they could do to us. And that is the reason why we want to talk about geoengineering, but it's not a serious option to address climate change. Um, Now, turning to the actual subject of what I'm supposed to be talking about, carbon dioxide emission reduction is, I think, best done through a carbon tax, which again sits very awkwardly with the Copenhagen Consensus, because you would want to raise money, you would not want to spend money. And another reason why it sits awkwardly with the Copenhagen Consensus is that climate policy is a long-term project. We will need a century at least to solve this problem, and therefore viewing it from the perspective of a short-term investment of a little bit of money is just not the right way to look at this particular problem. What I've done in the scenarios that I will show on the next slide is that I assumed that the Copenhagen money was put into a trust fund, and that trust fund is used to compensate for the costs of greenhouse gas emission reduction smeared out over a century. And of course, I made sure that the net present value of the two sums of money were equal. So if we now can go to the slides where we see all the numbers. In 2009, the Copenhagen Consensus for Climate, I showed 5 scenarios. I dropped 2 and I added another 2. So what you're looking at here is another set of 5 scenarios. And there's a whole bunch of numbers on this slide. From the top to the bottom, we're looking at increasingly stringent climate policy. The number in the first column, the column that is most to your left, represents the initial carbon tax. What I assumed is that climate policy will be implemented first best, both statically and dynamically. So a carbon tax will be imposed in the year 2015 on all sectors, on all countries, on all gases. No, sorry, I take that back. Not on all gases, only on carbon dioxide. And the carbon tax increases with the proper hoteling interest rate, which is roughly equal to the standard interest rate. So it's first best in both a static and a dynamic sense. The tax increases as we move to rows below, so we cut more emissions. So the third column contains the final concentration of carbon dioxide in the year 2100, which appropriately falls if we do more. Then the next column, NPV, you're looking at the net present value of the welfare losses associated with these policies. And what you see is that with the current budget for Copenhagen Consensus, you can afford to compensate people for a tax that is about equal to $1.80 per ton of carbon. And if you go to a tax of 2 or 3, you bust the budget. There's scenarios ranging up to $250 per ton of carbon. Why did I include that? Because the 425 ambient CO2 that you see there roughly corresponds to the EU and UN targets to keep the global mean temperature below 2 degrees above pre-industrial. That's how deep we will need to cut, and you can see that that would be fairly costly. The costs, as I said before, are measured there in trillions, to be precise, 48. And then in the final column, you're looking at the benefit-cost ratio of the whole thing, when you can see that you can justify the tax of 1.8 easily. You can justify a tax of 2 and 3, but if you go to $12 per ton of carbon, then it would be perhaps a bit difficult. Now, there is one thing I should say about this particular table, and therefore we need to move to the next table, the next slide, is that there's a whole lot of biases in here. And I listed 4 of these biases. First, the results are from one particular model that happens to be below the average you would find in the literature. The analysis ignores the parametric uncertainty within the model, as well as the possibility that the model may be completely wrong, so it also ignores between model uncertainty. And then also, and last not certainly not least, it works in dollars, and it assumes that a dollar to a poor woman is equal to a dollar to a rich woman. Now, if you correct for all these biases, then you should focus on the bottom line of this graph, and there are the new benefit cost ratios. And you would see that for a 1.8 dollar per ton of carbon tax that you can easily afford from your Copenhagen money does not have a benefit cost ratio of 1.6, but rather has a benefit cost ratio of 9.1. You can also see that a carbon tax, an initial carbon tax of $12 per ton of C can easily be justified and has a benefit cost ratio of 1.5. The EU and UN targets, you really, really need to stretch your assumptions to get anywhere close to an economic justification of the choices that our dear leaders made there. So final slides to wrap up. Modest emission reduction passes the benefit cost test under, I think, very conservative assumptions. If you use more appropriate assumptions, you can easily justify more stringent targets, but not as stringent as perhaps the people in the UN and the EU want us to believe, or the people in charge of these organizations. I started actually quite lengthily by saying that climate policy does not really fit into the Copenhagen Consensus. And if you agree on that, then I think that that is what you should conclude. We say, well, we looked at climate change, but it doesn't fit our framework, and therefore we're not going to come up with a recommendation. I think it would be misleading to, again, conclude that a carbon tax cannot be justified, because as far as I understand the economic literature, and as far as I understand benefit cost analysis and welfare theory, a carbon tax can be justified and should be imposed. And if you want to conclude differently than that, of course, you're free to do so, but I think it would be a wrong conclusion. Thank you for your attention.